Welcome to our study of the book of Zechariah, the prophet Zechariah. Zechariah comes as one of the post-exilic prophets, the post-exilic prophets being Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Joyce Baldwin in the Tyndale Old Testament commentary says this: there's a marked contrast between Haggai and his contemporary Zechariah. If Haggai was the builder responsible for the solid structure of the new temple, Zechariah was more like the artist, adding colorful windows with their symbolism, gaiety, and light. To make sure that their symbolism is rightly understood, an interpreting angel acts as a guide, adding in some cases a message that goes far beyond what could be deduced from the visions. So that sort of gives us a little taste of what we're going to be looking at as we go through the book of the prophet Zechariah. The book is named after the writer of the book, of course, being Zechariah. Zechariah's name means the Lord remembers, or perhaps he whom Yahweh remembers. And he might be called, as some writers have called him, the prophet of the restoration. Now, Zechariah as a name was a very popular name among the Hebrews. There are at least 27 men who had this name in the Jewish scriptures. Some list as many as 31. So it's a very popular name. But fortunately, we know a little bit more about this prophet than we do about some of the others, prophets and some of the other men named Zechariah. He's identified in the text in verse 1 as the son of Berechiah, the son of Iddo. Chapter 1, verse 1 says, "In the 8th month of Darius' 2nd year, the Lord's message came to the prophet Zechariah, son of Berechiah, son of Iddo." So that gives us sort of his lineage, which tells us a little bit about him. We also know, because of this, that he was of the tribe of Levi and the family of Aaron. He was descendant of Aaron. He served as a priest. Now, you may not get that just from verse 1, but when you look at the other references to this, you do find that out about him. Nehemiah chapter 12. Verse 12 says, "In the days of Joachim, these were the priests who were the leaders of the families." You drop down to verse 16. "Of Iddo, Zechariah." So identified as one of the priests who were leaders of the family. His father Iddo was as well, by the way. Now, he's probably not a descendant of the prophet Iddo of David and Solomon's days, as his grandfather Iddo was one of the leaders of the courses of 12 courses of priests back in Nehemiah chapter 12, identified in the first 7 verses. Ezra, by the way, simply identifies him in the book of Ezra as the son of Iddo. First 2 verses of Ezra. "Then the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, son of Iddo, prophesied concerning the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem in the time of the God of Israel, who was over them. Then Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, the son of Jehozadak, began to rebuild the temple of God in Jerusalem. The prophets of God were with them, supporting them." So identified there again as simply the son of Iddo. Now, we need to remember that son of doesn't always identify a direct father-son relationship. In this case, it would seem that his father, and some scholars suggest that he's died, and that's why he's called the son of Iddo. Homer Haley, in his commentary, simply reminds us that this is conjectural. Baldwin reminds us that often a generation is skipped when son of is used in Scripture. The Bible Study Notes had this to say: "Both Ezra and Nehemiah speak of Zechariah as a son of Iddo only. A probable explanation is that Zechariah's actual father, Berechiah, had died, and the prophet was raised by his grandfather, Iddo. The Zechariah, son of Berechiah, of whom Jesus spoke, was probably the martyred prophet by that name who may have been a grandson of the priest Jehoiada. He's mentioned in 2 Chronicles 24. Now, what we know about Zechariah is that he's identified early on in this prophecy as a young man. Again, chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. At this point, the angelic messenger who spoke to me went out, and another messenger came to meet him and said to him, "Hurry, speak to this young man as follows. Jerusalem will no longer be enclosed by walls because of the multitude of people and animals there." So he's a young man. And that raises some questions as to how old he was at this time to be called a young man. It's possible that he was one of the priests who returned from exile with Zerubbabel. In that case, he's a little bit older young man because it's been about 16 years or so since they've been back that he begins his prophecy. So that's possible. Jack Lewis, in his book on the Minor Prophets, believes that's the case. It's also possible that he was born just after their arrival in Judah, as it is his grandfather who's mentioned with those who came from Babylon. So perhaps he's born just after their arrival. If that's the case, he was about 16 at the time he begins prophesying. So someplace between those two, I think we'd have it. He could have been just a child who came along with his family as well. So all of that is possible. We do know that he worked at the same time as Haggai, although his prophecy would seem to cover a later period as well. It's also a whole lot longer than Haggai's. Haggai only had 2 chapters. We've got 14 chapters in Zechariah. Homer Haley wrote, "Zechariah, although a priest, was called to the office of prophet to assist Haggai in stirring the people to complete the temple. He began his prophetic ministry about 2 months after Haggai had begun his, and about a month after work was begun on the house of God." So we find here that his prophecy is about 2 months after Haggai's. They've already started working on the temple when he comes to lend his verbal support to what Haggai had been saying. Now, most of his prophecy, these first 8 chapters in particular, we can date between the years 520 and 518 BC. And the vast majority of scholars agree that the first 8 chapters would fall within these dates. Now, there is considerable diversity as to when the remaining chapters 9 to 14, were written. In fact, even who wrote them. And that's due to our modern critics. Many, though, do believe, as I do, that the entire book was written by Zechariah, and many of these take the view that these last chapters were written towards the end of his life. Of those who do not take this view, they vary from F.W. Farrer, writing in the end of the 1800s, who suggested that these chapters were written by unknown writers before the exile, to others who suggest they were written by someone in the 300s or even 200s BC. As when we studied Daniel, we commented that difficult for it to be in the 200s because we've got translation into the Septuagint that dates from the mid-200s. So probably not 200s. Homer Haley writes about this. He says, after considering the evidence for and against the unity of the book, one feels that Kyle has well expressed the view of conservative scholarship when he said of the conclusions reached on the evidence brought against the integrity or unity of authorship of the entire book, they are founded upon false interpretations and misunderstandings. In fact, there is a Jewish tradition that Zechariah later, along with Haggai, was one of the founders of what's called the Great Synagogue, or more properly, maybe translated, the Great Assembly. Jack Lewis commented on this. He said, Zechariah continued in activity for 2 years. After that, we hear no more of him, not even at the dedication of the temple. That, by the way, is recorded in the book of Nehemiah. Ezra, and then Nehemiah has the dedication of the walls. though later legend made both him and Haggai to be founders of the Great Synagogue, a legendary body of leaders of the post-exilic period. If you'd like to know more about the Great Synagogue, there is a good article that can be found in the Jewish Virtual Library, and on your screen there you should see the web link for that. The book of Zechariah contains several prophecies, possibly some suggest up to 10 in total. His last dated prophecy, Homer Haley tells us, was in the 9th month of the 4th year of Darius's reign, 2 years after Haggai's last recorded word to the people. So just to show you how Haggai and Zechariah fit together, I made up this chart here, which gives you the scripture, which gives you the dating of it, what that scripture says about the date. It's all dated from Darius's reign. And then, of course, the equivalent or the nearest equivalent we can get on our time scale, in our calendars. So Haggai 1:1 starts in Darius' second year, 6th month, and that seems to be equivalent to the 29th of August, 520. Verse 15, we're still in the second year, 6th month, but it's advanced a bit. They say that that's the 21st of September, 520. Chapter 2, we've got second year, 7th month, so advancing another month. 17th of October, 520, and that's when Zechariah comes into play in the 8th month, a month after that first part of Haggai chapter 2. And that's supposed to be in November of 520. The rest of Haggai, the 9th month, the month after Zechariah begins, 18th of December 520. And then Zechariah, the remainder of chapter 1, is dated in the 11th month, which advances us to February of 519. By the time we get to chapter 7, we're in Darius's 4th year and 9th month, which is the 7th of December in 518. So all of those show you the relationship there and how that follows chronologically between the two writings. They're working together. They're working at the same time. Haggai starts first. Zechariah ends last. The first 8 chapters are dated then between, in Zechariah, November of 520 and December of 518, and are divided into a number of visions. And the visions following what we find in the Net Bible. This is what we have. We've got the first vision, vision 1, chapter 1, beginning of chapter 1, and it deals with horses and an introduction and interpretation. If you've listened to our recordings on the book of Revelation with the British Bible School, we know we made reference to that when we looked at chapter 5 of the Revelation. Vision 2 has the 4 horns. That's the rest of chapter 1. Vision 3, the surveyor. That's all of chapter 2. Vision 4 is the priest. That's all of chapter 3. The 5th vision deals with the menorah, and that's chapter 4. In chapter 5, the beginning of chapter 5, we have vision number 6 of a flying scroll. And in the last part of that chapter, we have the 7th vision, which is the ephah. And then we have we have vision 8 in beginning of chapter 6, which is the chariots. And then chapter 6 ends with a concluding message. So those are the 8 visions that we have. The rest of the book are messages. We have in chapter 7 a message about false fasting. And chapter 8, we have a message about true fasting. Chapters 9 to 14 seem to have been given later in his life, at least I think that, and they are undated. Chapter 9 is a message concerning what's identified in the text as the land of Hadrach, centering on Damascus. So that would seem to be up in Syria. In chapter 10, we have the restoration of the true people. Chapter 11, the shepherds of God's people. Chapters 12 and 13, a message concerning Israel. And then in chapter 14, the coming day of the Lord. And so that's sort of an overview of what we're going to be looking at in this particular book of the prophet Zechariah. The background to the book, the same as the background to Haggai. So just to review our minds as to what's happened historically, we've looked at this when we studied Ezekiel with Patrick Boynes, which you can find those recordings on the BBS website, our YouTube channel, and as well as when we studied Daniel. So we've gone through this a bit. I think Haggai mentioned some of this as well. 721 BC, the northern kingdom fell to Assyria, and the people were taken into exile. In 605 BC, the first group were taken from Jerusalem into Babylonian exile, including in that group was Daniel and his 3 friends. In 597 BC, a second group from Jerusalem were exiled, taken into Babylon, and that included Ezekiel. Then in 586 BC, Jerusalem fell, and the remainder of the people, at least a good part of the remainder of the people, were taken into Babylonian captivity, leaving only the very poorest in the land. And some of these ended up in Egypt after there was an assassination of their governor, and they took Jeremiah with them. And then we advance all the way to 539 BC. Obviously, between 586 and 539, we had the rest of Ezekiel. We had a good part of Daniel taking place. But Daniel also coincides with what goes on in 539 BC. Babylon fell to Medo-Persia, and Cyrus let all the captives return to their homelands. We looked at that when we studied Daniel chapter 5. When they returned to Jerusalem, and they arrived there in 536, they're led by Zerubbabel. That's recorded in the first 3 chapters of Ezra. And when they returned, they immediately began to once again keep the sacrifices and the feasts of the Mosaic law. Before leaving Babylon, they had been given free will offerings from their neighbors, the items from Solomon's temple. They were also given a grant by Cyrus to rebuild the temple. They began work on the temple in the 2nd month of the 2nd year after they had returned to Jerusalem. The foundations were very quickly laid. A celebration was held. And then came the trouble. Not all their neighbors were happy to have the Jews back, and therefore they wanted to block any project they started that would make them permanent residents. Initially, it was blocking the building of the temple. Later, it was stopping the walls from being rebuilt. Their enemies ended up hiring counselors to persuade the people not to continue the work on the temple, and they were successful. And the work of rebuilding the temple ceased, and that's in Ezra chapter 4. It's in Ezra chapter 5, verse 1, that 2 new characters enter that narrative, and that's Haggai and Zechariah. Their task was to help Zerubbabel in encouraging the people to return to building the temple. These prophecies can be pinpointed with, I think, a great degree of accuracy because they took place in the 2nd year of Darius' reign, which we believe to be 520 BC. Zechariah began his prophecies 2 months, as we mentioned, after Haggai. And while Haggai's prophecies were given to stir up the people to once again rebuild God's house, and Zechariah was involved in some of that, starting at least what's recorded a little bit later than Haggai's, Zechariah's prophecies deal more with the future of Jerusalem and also of the coming Messiah. Homer Haley wrote, "The book by Zechariah may be thought of as a sequel to Haggai. The temple was begun and constructed in the midst of conflict, but it would be completed. Zechariah looks beyond the immediate temple to the Messiah and the spiritual temple of God, and the final consummation of God's purpose in the glory of the Messiah and his rule. This would be accomplished amid great opposition, but Jehovah would fight for his people and give them victory." The book of the prophet Zechariah is a unique book amongst the prophetic books. It's the longest of the 12, It's also the most obscure of the 12, and is the most difficult, therefore, to interpret, some suggest, of any of the Jewish scriptures. Joyce Baldwin in the Tyndale Old Commentaries wrote, "It's probably with these chapters in mind that Jerome wrote that most obscure book of the prophet Zechariah, and of the 12 the longest. Obscure though it is in places, chapters 9 to 14 are the most quoted section of the prophets in the passion narratives of the Gospels, and next to Ezekiel, Zechariah has influenced the author of Revelation more than any other Old Testament writer. For this reason alone, the book deserves careful study. It is the most messianic of the 12, as well as being the most apocalyptic of all the Jewish scriptures." Homer Haley wrote, "For this view some might dissent. In its messianic import, the book compares with Isaiah. The two of them are outstanding in their relation of the coming Messiah and his work." It also differs quite a bit from the other 12. Zechariah gives emphasis to visions as God's way of communication. We will find that angels occupy an important place in this writing, especially in the first 6 chapters. We also find apocalyptic symbolism in the visions. So a lot of things we looked at in Revelation in particular, and also in our study of Daniel, are going to come into play here as well. So initially I had divided this into 10 studies. If you want to follow us live, we're on Zoom on Monday evenings in 2021. So last night I did an introduction. We're going to look at visions 1 to 3 in the following week, and then visions 4 and 5, and then visions 6 through 8. And then we will look at the messages about fasting from chapters 7 and 8. And then we're going to look at the restoration of God's people, although we'll probably only be concentrating on the 14th on chapters 9 and 10. It turns out it looks like I'm getting an extra week. So I'm going to divide that into chapters 9 and 10. And then the 21st, we'll look at chapters 11 and 12. Again, further restoration of God's people. And our final week, which should be the 28th now, we will look at the coming day of the Lord in chapters 13 and 14. So I hope you can join us as we look through this. I know this is a bit shorter than the rest of these videos will be, but hopefully it'll be something that gives you a little taster of what we're going to be looking at in the prophet Zechariah. So I'm looking forward to leading you through this as we examine, as Jerome said, the most obscure of the prophets. And difficult at times to interpret, but hopefully we can arrive somewhere as we consider what Zechariah says, and we consider what our scholars have told us about this as well. Hope you can join us for the remainder of this study.